So what brings me to Moscow is that I'm professor of Bible and Biblical Exegesis at the joint appointment at University of Potsdam. It's okay? Yeah, with the handouts, I mean. They got stuck? Okay. University of Potsdam and rabbinical colleges, the Abraham Geiger College and Pius Frankel College, and we have joint programs with Moscow here as well. And the idea of having a school of Jewish theology in Germany is kind of a new thing, patterned on the German. Oh, I had one for you as well. You found it? Okay. German faculties of theology. And we're still trying to figure out exactly what we are all about. And my field of research actually is Dead Sea Scrolls, but I've recently been branching out more and more. And when I was approached by Stefan Probst, who's a medical doctor, organizing a conference, an interdisciplinary conference on end of life, as to whether I could contribute anything, I said, yes, but I'm a Bible scholar. What I could talk about maybe is receptions, is Second Temple documents of testaments. I'm trying to remember who here is in the room, who knows what, but these testaments of the patriarchs and other kinds of examples of last final words, deathbed words. And he said, yes, that's great. And he gave me a book, and now this is the first part. Sorry, the sources aren't numbered, but on the first page, where I have the first source, H.M. Chochinov Generativity Documents. So Chochinov begins his book about this, thank you, about this therapy with a quotation from the end of Genesis that we'll get to later on the source sheet, and sees this this end-of-life technique that he came up with as rooted in the Bible, in Jacob's and in other last final parting words. And what his technique is to, particularly with cancer patients, to have just a few concentrated sessions, because it's really for people who are already terminal, to produce these generativity documents, to have specially trained therapists work with these terminal patients and their families to produce a document that they can then pass on to loved ones or friends, whoever they choose to. And here is some of the dignity psychotherapy question protocols. And you can see it, maybe tying in a little bit to Michaela and Kate's paper, the primacy of narrative, right? What important narrative is for Chochinov and how that will play into the biblical use. But the first part is not biblical. This is simply a clinical technique that he developed. So tell me a little bit about your life history, particularly the parts that you either remember most or think are the most important. What made you feel the most alive? And then we have this looking back, right? What are the most important roles you have played in your life? But also, skipping a little bit more, looking forward. Are there instructions that you'd like to give? Are there hopes and dreams? What advice of words or guidance? So not so much an ethical will that we see in later Jewish tradition, but a life history together with some looking forward. And going to put that aside, hold on to it for a little bit, and think about other ways that one might want to use the biblical text before I put them in conversation with one another. So the next source we have on this page is the description of Abraham's death. And you have here verse 5, Abraham willed all that he owned to Isaac, and he gave his different sons gifts. And then verse 7, the total span of his life is 175 years. He breathes his last, dying at a good ripe age, old and contented, and he was gathered to his kin. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah. And on to the next page, verse 11, after the death of Abraham, God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac settled near Be'er Lahai-Roi. So what is, I think, striking about this passage is this is all, sounds like a lovely way to die, I think, to most people in Western society. And in fact, on the final pages in the table, so page 4, 5, 6, on the left-hand column, these are 10 criteria for what's called a good death that are provided by one 20th century clinician, that it be natural, mature, expected. And so he has this list of 10 kind of criteria for what Western society would consider a good death. And one thing that I want to say about this as I'm developing this new, I hope, model or methodology is that to be conscious of to what extent this conversation between what Western society values and what we find in the Bible, which is the cause and effect, because obviously the values of Western society were formed very much on what's already in the biblical text. So one way that biblicists or theologians would tend to read the biblical text is to have them be mutually confirming one another and say, oh, the Bible says this is a good death, Schneidman says it is too, this is what we idealize. And I'm trying to introduce another way of using the biblical text to reflect about what is it that one might see good or not, and how would that apply or not apply to individuals today. So one of the things I picked up on here in that list of 10 things, if you look at Abraham, the discussion of Abraham's death is that he's old, he's contented, his family is around him, he's buried in a family plot. Of the things that Schneidman lists, there are a couple of things that are missing. One is ruefulness. He says that at the end of one's life, one should still look back on some things that one hasn't done. And that doesn't apply to Abraham. That's not so surprising to think that this is a kind of perfect hero, so perfect that he doesn't even have any regrets. Another one is an obituary, and we can contrast that to the next source when Abraham does have a hesped, have some kind of eulogy for Sarah, and we don't have that for Abraham. But even that, I think that the value is already built into the text of Genesis, because the whole book of Genesis, not the whole book, the whole early parts of Abraham's life, and in a way the whole book, is a eulogy to Abraham. But one thing that is missing is something called generativity. And that comes back to our first source of the generativity documents, the idea that when somebody dies, they leave something behind. And it's quite striking that it's missing, particularly since, what page are we on now? On the second page. So skipping to the middle of the page, Genesis 18:17 to 19, we have this idea that Abraham was supposed to be instructing his children. In the story of when God sends angels to Abraham and is going to destroy Sodom, he says, "For I have singled him out that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of the Lord." So there's this expectation that Abraham's going to teach his children, but actually nowhere in the text do we have such a description of Abraham having this generativity. We do have a concern about biological generativity. We have his concern that he'll continue to have children. And Erik Erikson is the one who coined the term generativity. He says it is concern in establishing and guiding the next generation. So Abraham is very, very concerned about having children, but in terms of educating, in terms of Erikson's words, to have passed the wisdom of the tribe to younger generations, or to have shared meaning and memories and histories, to act like a beneficent sage, this is something that is missing in the text of the description of Genesis, and yet is part of the modern idea of what a good death would be. And with this in mind, I turned to, first of all, the bottom source on page 2. So here we have Jacob's deathbed words to his sons. This is what Chechenov pointed to. But on the following page, if we look at the book of Jubilees, Jubilees fills in a gap in a way that the modern clinicians think is very important. And so you have these last final words. I don't know if we'll have time exactly to compare the book of Jubilees with what's done in the generativity documents, but let's look at them a bit here. So in the 42nd book of Jubilees, dated to the 2nd century BCE, that's all I'll say about it now. In the 42nd Jubilee, in the first year of the 7th week, Abraham called Ishmael and his 12 sons, and Isaac and his 2 sons, and the 6 sons of Keturah and their sons. And he commanded them that they should observe the way of the Lord, that they should work righteousness and love each his neighbor, and act in this manner amongst all men, and that they should each so walk with regard to them as to judgment and to do judgment and righteousness on the earth, that they should circumcise their sons according to the covenant which he had made with them, and not deviate to the right hand or the left of all the paths which the Lord had commanded, etc. Then he looked back to the past. In verse 5, he told them of the judgment of the giants. So this is like Chechenov saying, what was most important to you? What advice would you give? What do you regret? What was good? And then again, verse 9, the instruction, but serve ye the Most High God and worship him continually and hope for his countenance always. Verse 10, then you will be for a blessing on the earth, and the nations of the earth will desire you and bless your sons in my name. And then he sent the sons away, so you can see Jubilees reacting to Genesis, right? This is the same idea of sending the sons away and giving things to Isaac. But beforehand, there's this whole insertion of these deathbed words, and it actually repeats again in chapter 21. Abraham calls Isaac alone and says, I become old, I'm going to die soon, and this is what I want to tell you. And again, don't follow idolatry, follow God, and keep all of his commandments, some specific ones, and then may God bless you. And then, interestingly, in verse 26, he went out from him rejoicing. So there's this idea of if you have this opportunity for generativity, for this good death, then right, one might expect that this kind of deathbed speech would leave somebody crying. But instead, Isaac is rejoicing because this is a natural, good kind of way for a death to proceed. One of the comparisons that I've made, though, so there's this similarity in the Book of Jubilees and Chechenov's generativity documents, but there's also a very big difference narratologically speaking or life speaking, because the generativity document, it is really all about that individual trying to look at their life and find meaning and transmit that to their loved ones. The Book of Jubilees, these are invented words by somebody who has a message that wants to, I don't want to be so strong and say the word manipulate, but I will for now, but take it, a little bit tempered, right? This is a manipulative theological religious message with a narrative constructed behind that. Is built up into it. So I think, again, that the contrast and the comparison both become useful. Sorry, it's going quite quickly, but we're all used to that, everyone here who's done this. So we're going to switch to the tables. And it's a little bit hard to follow what's going on in the Testament of Abraham from these tables, but I'll use them to kind of just talk about some of the ideas. The Testament of Abraham is a later work, and in our current forms that we have it, there are two main recensions, and there's definitely been some Christian reworking of it, but it is generally identified as a Jewish work. And it totally plays, if Jubilees kind of inserted things into the narrative, Testament of Abraham is entirely creative. So that, well, first of all, the whole point of it is that the angel of death comes to, or Michael, or later death, comes to take Abraham and tells him, the reason it's Testament of Abraham, give this testament, put things in order, because you need to die. And instead of the rejoicing and the acceptance, Abraham says, no way, I'm not going anywhere. And so this is whole non-testament of Abraham. This is a refusal to die. And there are all kinds of departures. The most blatant one from the biblical text is that Sarah is around throughout the whole picture. So instead of Abraham having buried Sarah, Sarah is around for Abraham's death. But there are other fanciful elements throughout. And what I've tried to show in this table is that the Testament of Abraham aligns very well with a lot of these criteria that I saw a little bit in Genesis, more in the modern clinical descriptions, but then misses one very major one on page 5, 6, and the end, is this idea of acceptance, because instead of acceptance, we have the resistance. And what that means then also is instead of this civilized death, or the value of a civilized death, we have this ridiculous, so I'm on the page 5, the third column towards the end. At one point, Isaac has a dream that the sun and moon will be taken from him, and then all the characters start crying. So he has a dream, and he goes into his father, as children do when they have a bad dream. His father is sleeping with the angel who's supposed to kill him. They're in the same bedroom. And Isaac wakes both of them up, and what's happening, and finally he tells them the dream, and it's about that he's going to die. So then Sarah hears them crying, so Abraham starts crying, the angel starts crying, Sarah hears them crying, and she starts crying, and it's just this kind of ridiculous excess as compared to the very calm rejoicing in Jubilees, or in another, when Abraham actually dies in Jubilees, there is weeping, but it's a respectful kind of weeping. Here in Testament of Abraham, it's entirely ridiculous. And of course, there's resistance all along. When at one point Abram says, well, if I can go up to the heavens and see a heavenly journey, then I'll go peaceably. And so that happens, and he has the tour of earth and of heaven, and he still refuses to. And in the end, how he finally does die is he needs to be tricked. But then, at the very end of the text, after death has tricked him, the text states that it's all fine because he's gone on to a better place. And so what I suggest here is that there is this subversive, many people say that the whole text is entirely subversive, that instead of teaching acceptance of death, it's teaching resistance, but I would say again, it's taking this fancifulness in the service actually of acceptance, because even though Abraham, the figure, never accepts his death, we, the readers, go through this experience with him. We go through the fears, we go through the anxieties, we go through the resistance, and in the end, we see him in heaven in a better place. How much time do I have? None? Enough. Okay, good. So let's go back to page 2. So that's sort of a summary of what I do with Abraham and Sarah, and with Abraham, and raise that as a possibility of ways to use the biblical text and the receptions of the biblical text to talk about end of life. The other topic would be bereavement. So on page 2, we have a description of Abraham's reaction to Sarah's death. And here, as I have in the small print over there, one way that would be simple to read this text is to kind of conform with 20th century models of what grief and grief work and bereavement are about. And I probably overread it, but as a heuristic, we'll go through and do this here. So in this description of Sarah's death, right, Sarah's lifetime, first of all, the Kubler-Ross model, right, the standard 5 stages or 5 types of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. They're very often described as stages, but for Kubler-Ross, she just said there are different kinds of phases that can overlap and work in different ways. But again, looking at how the biblical text could be read simplistically to align with this. So Sarah's lifetime, the span of Sarah's life, came to 127 years. The Hebrew is quite odd, right? Rashi and the other commentators comment on this 100 years and 20 years and 7 years, but even this idea of, when we're talking about death, to use the phrase, the days of the years of the life was, and here it's even repeated, the days of the life of Sarah. So I take that as a kind of signal maybe for denial, of emphasizing the life and not wanting to accept and recognize the death. Then she died in Kiryat Arba, now Hebron, and Avram proceeded to mourn for her and to bewail her. Lispod l'sara v'livkota. So lispod in modern, or already in rabbinic times, would mean to eulogize, but the root really has to do possibly with expressions of anger, and there's this very loud lamenting and crashing and different kinds of performance that I've associated with anger, possibly, and livkota, to cry for her. Sadness could go with depression. Then there's a long passage that I didn't fully give here of Abraham negotiating with the sons of Chet, with Ephron, to buy the plot in which to bury her, and I take that as possibly representing the bargaining in Kubler-Ross. Kubler-Ross is talking about an internal bargaining, this refusal to accept and bargaining with God, and if I do this, and what can happen, but it seems like a possible representation of this whole negotiation back and forth as Abraham is negotiating the process of dealing with Sarah's death. And in particular, a lot of the language that goes on there is he says, please listen to me, and they say, just listen to me. So there's this kind of also not listen, there's a whole lot of processing. And he starts off and says, he calls her Métis, right? My dead, so he's starting to get into acceptance. And then there's, the next chapter is a long description of the search for a wife for Isaac. So that's a kind of moving on to the next phase. And then here in chapter 24, Isaac does marry Rebekah, takes Rebekah, and then 67, Isaac then brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah and took Rebekah as his wife. He loved her and thus found comfort after his mother's death. And Abraham took another wife, whose name was Keturah. So there, that seems like acceptance. So on one level, these biblical verses can align very easily with the Kubler-Ross. more helpfully, I think, is to take this as an opportunity to challenge some of the ideas about bereavement, mourning, and grief. And in particular, if I said with Abraham and death and end of life, we're starting to think of maybe the good death is somewhat, what is that cause and effect between the biblical influence in Western society? When it comes to dealing with grief and bereavement, the clinical research is actually much more focused on a more postmodern approach, and even the term is used regularly in the clinical research to say that there's a great deal of variety, that it's not necessarily that people go through these phases exactly like this, or that after a year somebody will be healed. And also that this, there's a tendency to see this idea of healing as a very modern idea, because most of the understanding, the models and theories of grief come from Freud, who had initially spoken about grief work, Arbeit, and about these tasks, and basically he described this as death is a kind of version of having to deal with attachment. One has to detach. That is, the death of a loved one is, there was an attachment, and there needs to be a detachment before one, and then there needs to be a moving on. And Freud himself, after he saw World War I, attenuated his own descriptions and saw that there was a need to, or often a need to continue to attach and reprocess and kind of realign the relationship with the lost loved one. And so here too, this idea of finding comfort after the death, I think that what happens, I didn't bring all the midrashim, I didn't know what my time would be like, but there are midrashim that then deal with this further of maybe it's not so simple only to move on, to detach, but there's also a kind of attachment. And there are also other clues here in the text that can open up different areas of grief work. So for example, the question of unresolved grief. There's a midrash for this last verse here that Abraham married again and took a wife who was named Keturah. So there's a midrashic tradition that the Keturah is actually Hagar. And we can interpret that, or we can discuss that alongside the ideas of unresolved grief, because Abraham himself had been dealing with the grief of losing Hagar and Ishmael, not through death, but through having sent them away. And this becomes, again, I hesitate to use the word opportunity, but it becomes an opening for resolving that previous grief. And I think this is one of the most controversial concepts, or I shouldn't say controversial, one of the most difficult concepts for me in reading the literature about grief and bereavement is this idea that often bereavement can become an opportunity for growth, that through loss, people can find ways to connect, to appreciate love. I find that theologically difficult, certainly prescriptively. I think it's horrendous, but maybe for some people that can be a sort of kind of encouragement. Another direction, and I think I'll end with this kind of, another direction that I've gone in investigating these texts is the connection between Sarah's death and the previous text, which is the binding of Isaac. And there are many midrashim that talk about the connection between binding of Isaac and Sarah's death, that maybe this was the cause for her death. There's a description of Satan showing her what happened and her response to that, or even Satan coming in the guise of Isaac, so she knows that he didn't die, but the shock of it might have been. And the last direction that I go with this, one thing I want to come back to here, is that in the Middle Ages, there was the use of that idea to kind of find national consolation, because the idea that Sarah died, that Isaac was almost sacrificed, was used to, I don't want to say glorify, but to console about martyrdom. And so the binding of Isaac and also Sarah's death were used to kind of put a kind of consolation view on what that story was about. In modern Israeli poetry, it's being used in a different way, in a political way, to say that Sarah's death was a terrible thing if it was on account of the Akedah. And there are mothers who are opposed or putting their political voice either to understand the plight of bereaved women whose sons are dying in the IDF, or in other ways to politicize it in that direction. So I've covered a lot of ground. The last thing I think I'll say is if we look at what I said about the Testament of Abraham, that the idea of the resurrection becomes a way to, it looks as though the Testament of Abraham is all about protesting death and not accepting death, but the ultimate message, especially with the idea of the afterlife, becomes a way of acceptance. The same thing would be true with some of the stories for the idea of acceptance, whether it's Sarah and Abraham, but the idea of accepting death, that most of the models, the Kubler-Ross, the Freud, and some other ones, talk about acceptance as a very important part of Western bereavement and grief models. And these postmodern approaches say, oh, but what about other cultures where women, especially widows, are encouraged to continue grieving for the rest of their lives? Don't we want to validate those too? And after reading some of those texts, sorry, one more thing, yes. There was also a study of, again, bereaved parents comparing Druze families to Israeli Jewish families who had lost sons in, I think it was the Lebanon War. And they found that the Druze parents, who had a very strong belief in the afterlife, had, however clinicians will describe this, a much healthier, better recovery, better grief management than the Jewish parents who were less inclined to accept or believe in the afterlife. And so after reading these different sources, it occurred to me that the belief in the afterlife is actually a Western version of this non-acceptance as well in bereavement. So we read all these sources that say, oh, the final phase is acceptance and you need to continue your life, but there's also a kind of holding on to the attachment that's not usually recognized quite as much. And so what do we do with this? I wouldn't say necessarily clinically that, oh, look, if you have a better recovery, then you want to encourage a belief, assuming even that there is any causality to the correlation. But I do want to have some kinds of these types of discussion that helps us think maybe even those Jewish parents who didn't believe in the afterlife were living in a society where they were supposed to. So that's still the whole construct that they're dealing with. And so what I'd like to do, what I hope I've done a little bit here, is find a way to read these biblical texts that open up new ways of thinking and speaking about these very difficult, taboo often, subjects. That's it. Thank you.
Any remarks, questions? Okay, Alexei, please.
Thank you very much for your yes, and my question is about the image of death, the personality of death. Is it male, female? Is it a nature, a creature? Do we have some pictures maybe to these texts? And was death created by God? And is he or she mortal or immortal?
Okay, so the only text that I have that really deals with death, unless we want to see Satan as death in a way, which he isn't really, so is the Testament of Abraham. And they're definitely male, and I would have to, it's a great question, I have to go back and look, because as I was reading the text, I saw the medieval Grim Reaper, but that doesn't mean that that was exactly what was there. So there were certainly hints of it already, but obviously much more good-natured. Actually, I'm being ridiculous. It's on our, it's here. The last page. Do I have it? Well, what it says, the last thing on the column is that there are 72 types of death. So death, the figure, shows the 72 types of death. God told death, don't terrify Abraham, bring him with fair speech. So he takes the guise of just a person, as far as we could tell. Earlier it was Michael, especially for Abraham, because he's such a wonderful paradigm of goodness. He was going to have Michael rather than death. But then ultimately death has to come, and it's in the guise of a regular person. But when the household sees death, they actually all die and need to be revived. So whatever he is something very terrifying.
Thank you.
Yeah.
May I make a suggestion?
Sure.
The use of social scientific theory is very important to apply to texts. But you have to learn to focus. and you can't spread out all over the place, because then you lose the power of the theory that you're applying. When it comes to Medrash, there are many different Midrashim from different periods of history. To group them all together and just apply a theory to that, whether it be literature, whether it be psychological, you're losing the purpose. But if you take what you did, which is excellent in my opinion, and apply it to the Midrashim that focus on a certain period of time and are of a certain body of literature, then you're giving a message which I believe is very powerful. And saying the way to understand this, there's another way to understand it, there's another way to approach it.
So as you said, but the articles on this, there are 2 articles so far. One has already appeared in Bikor Cholim. The second one is forthcoming, and so I do break it down a lot
I can give you
more.
a third place to publish if you want.
Okay. But part of what I want to do, I think, might be to confuse. I don't want to give the powerful message. The only powerful message I want to give is that I'd like us all to engage in this text creatively. But it doesn't mean it's a hodgepodge. The second one, I have a diachronic progression through the Midrashim, through the medieval liturgy. So thank you. I agree.
Thank you so much.
So, I will ask a question.
I have maybe 2 questions. First of all, you regarded the Book of Jubilees as how did you put it, as religious manipulated.
Yeah.
Well, which I may agree and may not, but isn't the biblical text also might be regarded as religiously manipulated? But that's really not important.
So it might be, but I still want to answer that.
The second one,
Okay.
so I can, but I
Okay,
can
go
so you
ahead.
can answer
Yeah.
it together. Isn't belief in the life that after the death isn't in itself resistant to death and defies the acceptance of like modern?
Yeah. Okay, so the first part is that my point really was the narrative expansion. There had to be, I would say, even some more self-conscious manipulation. It's very tendentious. There are all kinds of ways to play with the text, but Jubilees is using the mechanism of this end-of-life speech, unless one wants to say that they were inspired in some of the ways we heard here. But I'm presuming that the author of Jubilees said, what is the message I want to give? And I'm going to put it into this framework. So yes, all religious texts or whatever, but that's what I meant as compared to the generativity documents that are not. It's really about the individual. That was the contrast I was drawing. And yeah, the non-acceptance, that I think is something that only really came out to me. That was part of my message. But when I would read the 20th century texts, they would talk about Western society, we need to reach a point of acceptance. And then late 20th century, 21st century, clinicians started to look around and say, actually, even in our society, first they said, look at the society over there and look at the Japanese widows, and not to mention sati in India, right? There are other cultures that much more prefer holding on. But then they said, oh wait, look also at widows in particular. Certain relationships in all cultures are about holding on. And then I said, oh wait, belief in the afterlife is another kind of holding on. It's a different kind of holding on because in many cases the person is still able to fully live their life because it's taking place on another plane. So differently from sati, where you literally end your life, or some of the other cultures where a widow should never remarry, here the individual gets to continue in some way, or is pressured to continue in some way with their life, but they still have that holding on at the same time.
Thank you.
I have a short question in some way continuing and in some way opposing the 2 previous ones. So in your presentation, for example, in your handouts, you decided to concentrate on 2 texts. 2 texts which are somehow very Hellenized, very tendentious, and so on. So why you choose first-hand them? Because they are more European, because they are more open to polemics because they are what?
Right.
What is your methodology in focusing on the Apocrypha of the Hellenistic times?
Right. So the first part really was just because I was looking for, that was my starting point of when I was asked to participate in this conference. I said, oh, the final testaments are the ones that work for me, and the biblical ones, Jacob or Joshua, just weren't as interesting for me as looking at it as a reception. Since Jubilees is a reception of the biblical text, I saw the expansion. And then once I did that, I got to the Testament of Abraham. Why did I choose to bring those here is because even though it was pointed out that I was kind of all over the place, it was easier to say something about them as compared to the Midrashim, and it's a little bit more complicated. So pragmatically, entirely.